これビデオ、
プレイ。
ビデオ
いやそれはい
らない。
はい。全部です。
しないでいいか。で、プレイ。
プレイ。
Hey, hi everyone. My name is Yuko Ishihara. I'm at the Ritsumeikan University, but I'm at the other campus in Osaka, Ibaraki campus, the College of Global Liberal Arts. My background is, well, I'm a philosopher, and my background is in Japanese philosophy and phenomenology. I feel really out of place giving a talk today because I don't know anything about quantum mechanics. I don't know anything about quantum cognition, but I'm in a project with Nao on the qualia structure project. And so, for some reason, Nao is really into Nishida's philosophy right now. And he has asked me to give a talk. So I'm really grateful that you've asked because it gives me an opportunity to talk about Nishida. And my mission in general is pretty simple, is to try to make Japanese philosophy and more specifically Nishida's philosophy more accessible, because I think there's a lot of interesting ideas in Nishida's philosophy, but his philosophy is not very easy to understand. His language, so Kobayashi Hideo wrote once that Nishida doesn't write in Japanese. He doesn't write, of course, in foreign language, but he also doesn't write in Japanese. So his Japanese, even if you're a native Japanese speaker, you can't really read Nishida. It's very difficult to understand. So what I'm doing is basically trying to translate his ideas into a more accessible language. I mean, part of this translation is really translated into English, of course, but more kind of, translating the ideas into more digestible kind of concepts and ideas. So that's what I'm trying to do today as well. So again, I'm not going to pretend that I know quantum theory. So I'm kind of leaving you to fill in the gap. So once I kind of introduce Nishida ideas, I think that you'll be able to kind of see interesting connections. And so I'll leave that up to you for you to do. But if you have been to, for some of you, or from outside of Japan, you've probably been to Kyoto, or maybe this is the first time in Kyoto. But you might have heard of the the philosopher's path. So this is close to Ginkakuji, the what's it called in English? Ginkakuji. A silver temple. It's close to a silver temple, not too far away from Kyoto University. It's called the philosopher's path because Nishida Kitaro and other philosophers used to walk down this path as a thought. It's a very contemplative path. It's very kind of narrow. It's kind of straight, and it allows you to really think. I did my master's degree at Kyoto University at the Japanese philosophy department, and I too often, went here to just kind of try to understand what Nishida is talking about, to kind of get into what he was doing. Yeah, so who's Nishida? He is the most influential Japanese philosopher in the 20th century. He's also the unintended founder of the Kyoto school tradition. So he founded this kind of philosophical movement called the Kyoto school tradition. It's controversial to kind of extract the essence of the Kyoto school tradition, like what is actually common to all these different philosophers that are called Kyoto school philosophers. But the basic idea is that these Kyoto school philosophers developed an original philosophy. So Nishida lived around this time during the Meiji period, when Japan opened up to the West, or was opened up, and kind of had to open up to the West. And a lot of the people, the scholars, were interested in, translation, right? Translating, importing Western ideas and translating into Japanese. But Nishida went a bit beyond that by trying to develop an original philosophy, not just by imitating what Western philosophers were doing, but by drawing on the spiritual and intellectual traditions of East Asia. So that includes Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, even a bit of Shintoism, you could say, but most notably Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism is the kind of backbone of Nishida's and a lot of the Kyoto School philosophers' philosophy. I want to start by underlying Nishida's kind of lifelong intuition. Right? I think all philosophers have some kind of intuitions, and they kind of develop their philosophical system based on this intuition. This is from his maiden work, An Inquiry into the Good Zen no Kinki in Japanese, from 1911. Here in the preface, he says, "I do not know what influenced me, but since long ago, I have had the idea that true reality must be actuality just as it is, and that the so-called material world is something conceptualized and abstracted out of it. I can still remember a time in high school when I walked along the streets of Kanazawa, absorbed in this idea as if I were dreaming." Right, so he's saying that he had this idea that true reality, right, actual reality, the most fundamental reality, has to be actuality as just as it is, genjitsu sonomama. So unfiltered, but this concrete reality, right? All these, all the kind of scientific theories, or even a lot of the philosophical theories of reality for Nishida appear to be very abstract, not based on this reality. So he wanted to grasp this reality. Genjitsu sonomama.
But what is this reality?
Yeah, well,
Yes, it is very disappointing for me. Yeah. For me, reality is material reality.
Yeah, so I think we'll get to that. Well, he has this idea of what the so-called material world for him is a kind of more of a objectified world that doesn't include the subject, us. But I think you have a bit more richer conception of the material world.
Is it different from the phenomenon?
Depends on what you mean with phenomena.
Like Kant.
Kantian phenomena. Well, for Kant, he had this idea that there is appearance, but there is things in themselves. So he had this duality. So for Nishida, does appeal to something like phenomena, but for him, phenomena is actually what he would call pure experience. Pure experience. So junsui kenken is a Japanese word. The word itself he takes from William James. But what he means by it is quite specific and unique. So in one of his works, this is an example that he gives. I see the flower. In this moment, the flower is me, I am the flower. Okay. So normally speaking, this kind of statement doesn't make sense. We say, I'm not the flower. So clearly, I mean, this might be metaphorical speech or something like that, but clearly I am not the flower. The flower is not me. There is a distinction to be made. So I see the flower. In that experience, normally we would say, I, the subject, see the flower, the object. Now, Nishida questions this basic framework, this basic assumption. He says, okay, is that way of understanding experience the most basic type of experience, or are we already introducing a kind of conceptual scheme onto this basic fundamental kind of experience? Are we not already tainting our experience when we introduce such subject-object duality? That was his question. And he puts forth this idea that experience in its most basic form has to be called pure experience. This pure experience, he says, it's prior to the subject-object duality. Right? That's a negative way of framing it. More positively speaking, it's a kind of experience, right? It's a kind of experience where you're fully absorbed in an experience, for example, in seeing the flower, that there is no distinction between you and the flower anymore in that very moment, right? So this kind of experience can happen, like, for example, in sports, like when you're fully absorbed in sports, playing, right? Playing basketball, you're one with the ball. Like there is no distinction that you make between yourself and the ball when you're in the flow, right? There are these kinds of experiences, and he's saying those experiences are not the exception. Those experiences highlight what is fundamental about our experience. When we think that, no, there is a subject and an object, the ball, we're already introduced thought, reflection, right? So he's trying to go back to kind of pre-reflective experience. He calls that pure experience. So in that kind of pure experience where it's prior to judgment and prior to reflection, we can say this kind of statement that the flower is me, I am the flower, wouldn't actually make sense. Okay, so I wanted to introduce this idea because this is like the fundamental point, the kind of foundation of his philosophy. He later drops the term pure experience because it has these kind of psychologistic kind of undertones that he didn't want to associate anymore. And he wants to establish a more logical foundation for his philosophy, which is with the part that I'm going to expound on now. But it's important to know that this is the basic idea, right? And he's not going to move away from that.
Precisely, my thinking was, can you call pure experience? Yes. If you cannot
talk about it or reflect on it. Yeah, that was one of the problems, right? How do you build a philosophy on top of that when you're saying that we can't really talk about it? I want to say a bit about his relation to science. So when people talk about Nishida's philosophy, especially Western philosophers, when they take some interest in Nishida's philosophy, it's because of the Zen Buddhist background, right? There's something very different about his philosophy. So people focus on this kind of religious or spiritual aspect of his philosophy, which is fair enough. But he also had what's often overlooked is that he had a very serious interest in science, mostly math, physics, and biology. He himself wasn't sure if he should pursue math or philosophy, and so he consulted his high school teacher, who told him, he said, and if you want to become a philosopher, you have to be pretty creative or something like that. And he felt, well, maybe I don't have that creativity, but still he didn't feel like he can just devote himself to math, which for him felt a bit dry. Okay, so that's how he decided to pursue philosophy, but that reflects his deep interest in math and science in general. In the last 10 years, especially, he wrote extensively on science. These are just a list of articles where he deals quite extensively with science. A lot of these articles haven't been translated into English, unfortunately. Okay, so quantum physics and Nishida. He was very, very much excited about the advent of quantum physics. He felt that it provided the scientific grounding to his philosophical ideas. He felt that finally, physicists are catching up. That's basically what he thought, I think. In his essay, The World of Physics, he says, people today say that physics has become non-intuitive. On the contrary, I believe that traditionally physics has been dogmatic as an object-oriented logic. Today, physics has finally returned to the intuition of the bodily self. Okay, so again, this is already a dense passage because he's employing a lot of terms that we don't really understand. And yes, what does he mean by non-intuitive? But basically, I think he's trying to say that quantum physics is an important progress in physics because it includes our embodied engagement with the world. The fact that we're actually embodied and that the fact that scientific experimentation involves our bodily engagement, that's reflected in the actual science. He thought that that's a huge progress. And so in general, I think he felt that quantum physics is an attempt to grasp actuality just as it is versus abstract traditional physics. So he calls this object-oriented logic. So that's basically saying logic that's purely focused on objects, things, right? But doesn't take the subject into consideration.
Is it the same as in quantum physics we call observer? So now observer played the role. Okay, thank you.
Yes, I think that's what he means. Here's another quote from him where he talks about or makes reference to quantum physics or quantum mechanics. The kind of knowledge quantum mechanics provides has a much deeper and broader objectivity than that of classical physics. The rule of quantum mechanics is a rule that contains experimental operations. It's not a rule opposed to the self, but a rule that envelops self. So it's a rule that envelops or includes the observer.
Yeah.
Good. All right, so I want to kind of zoom in on this passage here, especially this last part. He's saying the world of quantum mechanics is not a world opposed to the self, but a world that envelops the self. And before that, he's saying that quantum physical world has a deeper and broader objectivity compared to classical physics, and that he says the quantum physical world is a world that envelops the self as opposed to the world that's opposed to the self. So what is this rule that envelops the self? The Japanese word here is tsutsumu, jiko tsutsumu sekai. And actually this word envelops, tsutsumu, is a key word in Nishida's philosophy. And I think here lies the key to understanding his novel theory of knowledge. So this is the point that I want to talk about today. So the title of my talk, by the way, was Nishida's Revolution of Kant's Copernican Revolution. And I was kind of alluding to the title of this workshop, Quantum-like Revolution. But Nishida himself, maybe I talk about that here before, maybe, yeah. Nishida himself says that, referring to Kant's Copernican Revolution, says, my standpoint is the opposite of Kant's epistemological standpoint. It's the complete reverse, a revolution of the Copernican revolution. Instead of going from reason to fact, it goes from fact to reason. And fact here means reality, or this kind of concrete reality. So what I want to do is try to cash out in what way Nishida tries to actually revolutionize Kant's Copernican revolution, and in what way Nishida's theory of knowledge is revolutionary. And as I said, I think the key lies in this word tsutsumu, or envelop, the world that envelops the self. And just a side thing, but Japanese culture, it's a lot of emphasis on enveloping, the act of packaging, you could say. So if you know what this is called furoshiki. There's this whole culture of furoshiki, which is just this piece of cloth. But the beauty of it is that it can do a lot of things, right? And it can serve several purposes. Of course, its main purpose, supposedly, is you put something in it, wrap it in, and then you bring it to someone's place as a gift to give a gift, and then you bring the furoshiki back home, right? It can take the shape of whatever that's inside. Right? It's very malleable. It can also be used for other purposes. So originally, like traditionally, people would take their stuff to the sento, to those what do you call those public baths, to bring their stuff in the furoshiki, and then after they put their clothes out, they would change their clothes on. So they'll use it as a towel, essentially, like a foot towel, right? So it serves a lot of purposes. And if you go to like a department store, Takashimaya or whatever, you see that Japanese people put a lot of emphasis on packaging. Like, it's so beautiful, right? The packaging is so beautiful. Very different from American culture. I was brought up in the States. Christmas, kids like tear the packaging, like they don't care. They will just want to see what's inside. This is very different in Japan. The Japanese culture emphasizes the beauty of packages and the actual activity of packaging. And they just wanted to allude to that because I don't think that's it's not a mere coincidence that Nishida focus on this concept of tsutsumu, or envelope, or package. Better word than packaging is envelope for our purposes here. Okay, so what's Kant's Copernican revolution? So Nishida says that he wants to revolutionize Kant's Copernican revolution, but let's review what Kant's Copernican revolution is. So before Kant came, the prevalent idea in epistemology is that the mind is like a kind of passive mirror, right? It represents things that are out there in the world. So cognition must conform to object. The objects are there, and our cognition has to conform to that, right? Kant reversed this idea. That's why it's likened to Copernicus. Instead of thinking that we have to conform to object, he says objects must conform to us. And that is to say that the human mind provides all these structures that allows us to have some sort of cognition of the world. Without that structure that we provide, the mind, so forms of intuition, these are forms that our senses already have some sort of structure, right? Time and space, then categories of thought, and intellect, understanding also has some structure, and these together allows us to have a cognition of objects. So against the prevalent view until Kant that mind is this kind of passive mirror, he introduced this idea, and this is from Lee Braver, a Kantian scholar, who calls it the active knower thesis, that mind is more like a factory, right? It's a factory that kind of puts together things. So Kant is not saying that we create the world like God. He's saying that no, the fabric is provided by the world, but we need to kind of put it together, right? Otherwise, it's just chaos. So that's why it's likened to a factory. Right? So that was Kant's Copernican revolution, saying that knowledge is not something that we just, we're passive. The mind is not just passively receptive to the world. We actually contribute to what we can know, to what's out there in the world. Now, Nishida attempts to revolutionize Kant's Copernican revolution. He says, in this very famous essay, Basho, from 1926, he says, rather than tackling the issue of knowing by starting from the opposition of knower and known as hitherto undertaken, I wanted to start off even more deeply from the subsumptive relationship of judgment. Okay, so for Nishida, the main problem with Kant is that, and not just Kant, but a lot of the epistemological theories at that time, the main problem in the West was that they all assumed that the knowing mind is a knowing subject. Right? It's just to say that the opposition between the subject and object is presupposed. That's the starting point. Right? In order to know, the knower knows the object. Right? That seems like a fair starting point to make, but Nishida wants to avoid that, taking up that standpoint, right? Because again, he thinks that there is a much more fundamental layer of experience, like pure experience. In order to get to that experience, we cannot assume this starting point. So in order to avoid this problem, to understand the deeper nature of the knowing mind, Nishida wanted to start with the purely logical structure of judgments.
Can we read this as with replacing knowing as an experiencing, or in here knowing and experiencing completely different thing?
I think it's okay, but there might be a bit of a well, for Nishida, I think it's important that it's knowing here, because he wants to take so the starting point he wants to take is to focus on judgment. When we talk about judgment, it's mostly experience is too broad of a term. So he wants to focus on knowledge as experience that take the form of judgment, which would be knowledge.
Does knowing equal judgment?
Oh, that's a very important point, actually. The short answer is no for Nishida, but he wants to start with judgment because typically when we think of knowledge, we think of judgment. In order to know something, we judge. A is B. Right? A very simple A is B kind of structure. So he wants to start with specifically subsumptive judgments. For example, red is a color, is a subsumptive judgment. Subsumptive judgment takes the form of S is B, where S is the grammatical subject, right? And P is a predicate. And so red is a color, or S is P here means red, the particular, is subsumed or enveloped in the color, the universal, right? So the logical, that's the grammatical relationship, subject, predicate, right? But the logical relationship underlying this grammatical structure is that particular is subsumed in the universal. So red is a color, translates to logically, red is subsumed in color. So if we were to write a little diagram, draw a little diagram here, it would look like this, right? So there's the color, the universal, and red is a particular. Of course, there are several particulars in here, not just red. So Nishida rephrases S is P, red is color, to S is subsumed in P, right? And further, he rephrases it into S is within P. S, what P ni oite aru is a Japanese, right? So in rephrasing S is P into S is subsumed or enveloped in P, or S is within P, what this allows him to do is first emphasize the internal connection between S and P. So when you say red is a color, you could think that there's something that's red, there's something that's color, and they are externally related by this copula is. Now, instead of taking that route, he wants to emphasize that they are internally connected. So that is to say that the SP relation is logically prior to the individual existence of S and P. So it's not the case that there is first red and something like, so the particular, and there's a universal, and there's some sort of relation between them. He's saying, no, there's first these universals which individuate itself. So he's trying to avoid this kind of duality, or in this assumption, assuming the individual existence of these things.
So is red individual existence? No.
It's a particular.
Particular. Not individual.
It's not an individual thing. Right? A red can be instantiated in different ways. Right. So
red means the red thing?
Red here just means red as a color.
As a color. It's a
Red.
particular color.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah. Red is a particular color.
Property of something.
Name of the property.
Which could be a property.
Could it be considered as a kind of particular thing of the within the observable? I was thinking.
Many
labels,
Many
but
colors.
observable as a sort of a collection of the thing, and that's
Yeah,
what's the color here.
Because red is an element of the set of colors.
Okay.
This is modern logical interpretation of this kind of judgment.
Okay. Right. So yeah, he starts to focus on substantive judgments, SSP, and he is rephrasing that into this kind of, specifically this form S is within P, right? And here, in doing so, he wants to understand judgment as a self-determination of the universal. Judgments are universals determining itself. So the universal's process, the judgment is a universal's process of particularization. So it's color. So in a sense, color is more logically prior. Is that okay to say? Yeah, logically prior to the particulars, because it's the colors that's individuating itself.
Class.
Class.
It's a class, okay.
Yeah, red is the individual.
So I think the Masanao is concerning about clarification of S is an element of P or S is a subset of P. So of course both are important in mathematics.
Okay.
But I also concerned about which is better interpretation of the oiter.
Oh,
The reason.
okay.
So
Okay.
the S and P is subset or S is subset of P or the element of P or more general?
I don't, Steve, maybe you can help.
In this recent PDS article, they had this situation where the argument structure being, you can say something like the spherical object is red, and you can also say the red object is spherical. So it's not quite so straightforward as S as a subsumption. It is and it isn't, because the predicate can be actually put in the other. So it tends to be a bit more complicated than what. And also, where you say SP is logically prior,
Yeah.
Actually get that to work. I can't see how it could. I guess it could from a universal construction perspective, but because the relation really has to bind the two. The S, like in the sphere of the red, the relation has to bind the redness and the spherical property in some product. So you can't do that without having the S and the red and the spherical property in the first place. This puzzled me for a long time actually until I read this article, and I'm still puzzled by it. But it just speaks to the flexibility of language where you swap the subject and predicate. So it kind of suggests not such a direct.
Maybe related, but having said that, I think the most genuine interpretation is by using category theory. S arrow P. This arrow is with the pure interpretation.
Okay.
Yes, that was anyway.
Okay, I will explain you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Ritsumeikan
No.
he's a philosopher in Poland, and he analyzed this kind of sentence S is P, and he has some accents about that, and he can distinguish individual and class. And if your S can be said about S is S, or then S can be determined as individual. Because the individual can be the subject in there is some order of the subject and the predicate. And then predicate cannot be subject in the same way.
That might be related to what Nishida wants to say ultimately.
Maybe the Nishida's case is individual. It's an element of class.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
This means that subsumed or
Yeah, I agree. And in category theory, there is a notion of generalized element, which is just an arrow. So I agree with Masanao, and I think it is more suitable.
Okay.
Use in terms of.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Here I'm basically following what Nishida writes, and Nishida's writing, and the kind of traditional interpretation of Nishida. But again, this kind of feedback I only get from, typically from philosophers.
He claimed that this distinction is already arise in Aristotle.
Okay, interesting.
Because the logic and the time is.
Oh no! Okay, sorry.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So I'll be quick. The main idea for him to reformulate SSP into this S is within P is to highlight P, the predicate, as the place where S is in place. So this is where his key concept, basho, meaning place, comes about. His question, so he starts off with subsumptive judgment, but then his question is, well, what are these judgments based on? What is the ground of these judgments, right? what grounds this kind of knowledge that would take the form of judgments. And he thinks of two ways of going beyond judgment, what could be the basis of judgment. One is the direction of the grammatical subject, and one is the direction of the direction of the predicate. If we follow the direction of the grammatical subject, or in particular, we get Aristotle's definition of substance in Greek, hypokeimena, which literally means the underlying thing. Right. So for Aristotle, the underlying thing, the kind of basic component of reality, essentially, is that which is subject but never predicate, which for Aristotle is individual things. Okay. Right. If we transcend, that's the word Nishida used, transcend towards the direction of the grammatical subject, we get Aristotle's individual thing. Now, we can also, this is not something that Aristotle thought, but we can also reverse Aristotle's definition of hypokeimenon, the underlying thing, in the direction of the predicate, and we get that which is predicate but never subject. Right? Okay, so we get these two notions of substance or underlying thing. Now, Nishida says even an individual thing, according to Aristotle, should in principle be in some place, right? Even if it's beyond judgment, that's the form of the judgment. So it has to be within some universal, not a typical kind of universal, but some universal. And that's why he says that which is predicate but never subject is a deeper sense of being. Something like that. And this is where we get Nishida's new ontology and epistemology. The underlying thing for Nishida is not individual things like Aristotle thought, but it's the place that makes knowledge possible. Okay. So to be, this is Nishida's formulation, to be is to be within a place. Right? For something to exist, it has to be in a place. Or to know something, it has to be in a place. And this place for Nishida is consciousness or the self. So knowledge in the form of judgment presupposes consciousness as a place of knowledge. This is to say that consciousness is the place that makes possible all predication and all determination, right? It's in the further direction of the predicate. It's that which makes possible all predication, all determination. But this place itself, by definition, because it's that which is predicate but never subject, right? By definition, cannot be predicated, determined itself. It cannot become the subject of a judgment. That's why Nishida calls this place of nothingness. This place is not a thing. It cannot become the subject of predication. In other words, it's indeterminable. So consciousness, in Nishida's definition, is indeterminable. It's because it's the furthest direction of the predicate. It's a place of determination, but it is itself indeterminable. Okay, so Nishida also speaks of consciousness to mirror itself within itself. Yeah, I don't have time to explain what exactly he means by that. That's the way he formulates this structure of consciousness, or this dynamic activity of consciousness. It mirrors itself within itself. So going back to Kant thought that mind is like a factory. It actively puts together reality from the fabrics of reality. Nishida doesn't agree with that. But he's also not saying that let's go back to the representationalist view, where we just simply, this use of the word mirror seems to suggest he's reverting back to representationalist view of the mind. But he doesn't want to think that mind is a passive. He doesn't understand mind as a passive mirror, because this view ultimately presupposes the subject-object duality. It's not going far enough. So for Nishida, instead, mind is like an enveloping activity that is itself no thing. It's not a thing, right? But it makes possible all cognition. So it is like a mirror, but just that it's dynamic. It's doing things. It's a very dynamic process. And he eventually extends this idea of the mind to the whole reality. So it's not just that the mind does this. The whole reality has this enveloping kind of mechanism. So going back to that quote, the role of quantum mechanics is not a role opposed to the self, but a role that envelops the self. Here, the role opposed to the self means an objectified role that leaves the subject out of the picture, the observer out of the picture. But this assumes a subject-object duality. Role that envelops the self is understood under the model of the predicate logic. So you can call Nishida's logic a kind of predicate logic. And this is to say that the role that envelops the self is reality that's not, reality is not based on discrete individual things, like Aristotle thought, but it's ultimately no thing. It's ultimately indeterminable. Reality itself is ultimately indeterminable. But it's indeterminable, but it's not that it doesn't do anything. It determines itself while being itself indeterminable. So this is again, this is coming from his Eastern Zen Buddhist background, which I didn't really highlight so much, but this is pretty novel in the history of philosophy. Supposedly, Nishida is the first to point out, to kind of reverse Aristotle's logic and to want to kind of say that ultimately reality is not a thing. The underlying thing is not a thing. It's not indeterminate. It's indeterminate. It's nothing. And Nishida understood quantum physics as attempting to grasp reality in this way. Yeah. That he saw a deep resonance between his views of reality and quantum physics. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Break.
時間管理とか。
すいませんでしたね。
時間にしてるから何時から何時まで。
いえいえ。
非常に面白い。また詳しく説明していけばいいのかもしれませんが、非常にエッセンスができると。
でも、多分間に合うんですけど、バスの時間が出るように読めないんで。
Or you can see to今回やりたいので、なんかで48時間しかないので、なんか、具合が悪かったら、やり直して、今、USB はあるので、USB に作ってもらえば、
だからある程度の違うの。
全然、短期化によって、取引的なことで、部分的にこう、究極的なことになるし、違うので、あれの部分もちゃんと OK ができてあげないといけない。だから、その変換は、まあ、できてきます。だから、あれの数えによって、伝えることにも、限定だと。